Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, The Man Crisis. Learn why so many men are struggling to find their way in an increasingly gynocentric world in The Man Crisis. Get your copy of The Man Crisis in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.
Historical Men in Crisis. One of my viewers wanted me to do a special installment for the Historical Men in Crisis series. And for this special installment of the Historical Men in Crisis series, they wanted me to talk about the book The Onion Field, which was written by Joseph Wambaugh, and the incident that took place in the pages of The Onion Field, where two plainclothes LAPD officers were overpowered by a pair of suspects who kidnapped them and then drove them to an onion field. And as they were driven to this onion field, one of these officers lost their lives and the other was traumatized as related to this tragic incident, which basically changed the way LAPD officers operated in the field. Now, the entire tragedy of the onion field took place on March 9th of 1963 when officers Ian Campbell and Carl Hettinger were riding plainclothes in an unmarked police car. And as they were riding plainclothes in this unmarked police car, they let their guard down as they pulled over a 1946 Ford Coupe containing two suspicious-looking individuals, Gregory Powell and Jimmy Youngblood Smith, and didn't follow police procedure as related to these two men who had allegedly participated in a string of robberies and each had a pistol tucked into their trousers. Now, as Powell came up on the officer Ian Campbell, he wound up overpowering Ian Campbell because Ian Campbell basically, I believe, took him for granted because he was a white male, and because he thought, oh, this is a white male, I don't really need to see them as a threat, and didn't follow procedure as related to having this individual step out of the vehicle so that they could check their credentials. And what happened was that Gregory Powell overpowered Ian Campbell, and as he overpowered Ian Campbell, he possibly took the gun that was hidden in his pants out and put it in the back of Officer Ian Campbell. And as he put that gun in his back, he then told Ian Campbell to tell his partner that he has a gun in his back and give him his gun. And Carl Hettinger basically did as his partner requested, and as he did as his partner requested, both officers were disarmed and then forced into the back of the 46 Ford and driven all the way north from Los Angeles to Route 99 to an onion field near Bakersfield, where both men were forced to leave the vehicle. And this is where Ian Campbell was fatally shot and killed. And after Ian Campbell was fatally shot and killed, Carl Hettinger managed to escape, running nearly 4 miles to a farmhouse. And as he ran to the farmhouse, this is what led to these two individuals to look to split up. And as they split up, this eventually led to them winding up getting arrested. Now, the police in LA found out that the motive for this murder was because both of these individuals already knew that they had committed a crime. Now, Gregory Powell thought that because he had kidnapped two police officers, that he had violated the state's Little Lindbergh law and was definitely going to be executed. And he thought he was going to be executed because of his misinterpretation of the law. And he thought he was going to be executed because he didn't understand how the law worked. Because the Little Lindbergh law, which was established as related to the kidnapping of Charles Lindbergh's son, was about people who committed a capital crime, such as murdering somebody during the middle of a kidnapping or ransom. However, the kidnapping of these two police officers would have only been punished by life in prison, and that would have been the final sentence. But once these individuals wound up murdering this police officer, they wound up on the road to being tried as related to the death penalty. Now, this entire incident definitely fits the pattern and profile for beta males that I talk about in my book, The Man Crisis. And this great tragedy happened because two of these males basically were men in crisis ever since they were young. And because these males were men in crisis ever since they were young, what happened with these males is that they were living in, again, a rose-colored reality, and that reality came crashing down on the night of March 9th of 1963 because neither of these men understood how life worked, and because they never understood how life worked, they basically were men in crisis who committed one of the most heinous crimes in American history. Now, both of these men are textbook beta males because when I look at the background of Gregory Powell, he definitely fits that pattern and profile for beta males that I talk about in The Man Crisis because he was raised in Michigan by a dysfunctional family with a father who was a musician who was oftentimes absent during his childhood, and his mother had serious health problems, and that left Gregory Powell just basically on his own as he looked to take care of his three younger siblings. Now, as he looked to take care of his three younger siblings, he was basically overwhelmed, and as he was overwhelmed, he just got so frustrated about his life situation and not having any sort of life skills or survival skills due to his parents just not caring about him, and he wound up running away from home and hitchhiking to Florida, where he met a Catholic priest who basically sexually abused him and exploited him. And after sexually abusing him and exploiting him, this is where Gregory Powell wound up on the road to participating in a series of crimes, from stealing money and cars from his sister, stole another car when he was 18, and was in and served time for car theft, and then when he was 20 years old, released from prison. And at one point, again, as his family moved to California, he had a craniectomy to remove a brain tumor from his head, but he was in and out of prison for 10 of the 13 years of his adult life, and eventually he was paroled in 1962, where he worked as a thief who robbed liquor stores and also worked as a gay hustler, hustling gay men, and also had participated in a series of armed robberies. So he had been participating in a series of crimes before he had hooked up with Jimmy Lee Youngblood Smith on that tragic night in 1963. Now, Jimmy Youngblood Smith himself was another beta male, and he was another beta male who was on the road to becoming a man in crisis, being born in Texas to a teenage mother who basically abandoned him and left him to be raised by his maternal great-aunt or his maternal grandmother. So he was in a matriarchal single mother environment. And as he was in that single mother environment, his great-aunt was partially disabled from shooting herself in the leg with a .45 caliber pistol. So that basically shows that he was basically in a dysfunctional household. And as he was in this dysfunctional household, he was also molested by his stepfather, and at 16 he ran away to Los Angeles, where he was sent to juvenile hall for burglary. And by age 20, he basically was not only on a road to crime, he was also creating more people who would be on the road to becoming children in crisis, because he was the father of two illegitimate children he didn't support. And by 1950, he had been arrested for burglary and narcotics possession, and had been arrested again for burglary. And like Gregory Powell, was in and out of jail. And as he was in and out of jail, eventually he wound up running into Gregory Powell, and both of these men were driving in this Ford coupe on that infamous night of March 9th, 1963. And as they ran into these two officers for making this illegal U-turn and having an illegal license plate light, what happened was they wound up overpowering these officers, and as they overpowered these officers and kidnapped them, they drove them to the Onion Field, where Gregory Powell asked Officer Ian Campbell if he'd heard of the Little Lindbergh Law, and when he said that yes, he wound up shooting him in the head, according to one report. Now, after Ian Campbell fell to the ground, it was alleged that both men possibly wound up shooting Ian Campbell 4 more times. When Hettinger saw this, he then ran and escaped, and as he escaped, he wound up running for his life 4 miles to a farmhouse where he finally called police. And after this happened, this is where Powell and Smith split up, with Powell stealing a 1957 Plymouth and trying to drive back to Los Angeles, and Smith heading to Bakersfield. Now, Powell basically was apprehended in Los Angeles a couple of hours later, and Smith was arrested the next day in Bakersfield for the murder of Ian Campbell. And after participating in these crimes, what happened was we had a trial, and at that trial, Smith was basically convicted of first-degree murder, and after being convicted of first-degree murder and being given the death penalty, the whole California Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty, leaving these men with a life sentence. But what's really troubling is that in the 80s, what we saw was people looking to give these men parole. Now, in 1982, Jimmy Youngblood Smith managed to get parole, but the whole thing was that you had Powell, who was looking to get parole, which is really disturbing. You had 2 men who participated in a string of crimes and also murdered a police officer, but in the blue state of California, they wanted to give these men parole, even though these men had a history of felonies, showing me how completely out of touch the state of California has been for many years. Now, while Jimmy Youngblood Smith did get parole, what happened in the case of Gregory Powell is that the daughter of Ian Campbell, Valerie Campbell, managed to demand that this man remain in jail, and thankfully this man wound up being locked up for the rest of his life. And as Gregory Powell was locked up for the rest of his life, what happened was that Gregory Powell wound up dying of prostate cancer inside of that prison at 79 years old, and he had a longer life than he gave Ian Campbell, and he had a much longer life than Ian Campbell was allowed to have. So this man basically wound up doing time for the rest of his life. But in the case of Jimmy Youngblood Smith, he was allowed to terrorize the state of California for many more years. I mean, he was allowed to terrorize people after his parole hearing. I mean, after he was paroled, six months later, he was rearrested on Long Beach in California for drug charges and pled guilty to 2 counts of selling heroin and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Then released again in 1986, where he was arrested in Burbank for driving under the influence of a narcotic. And in 1989, he was arrested for terrorizing and looking to attempt to sexually violate a woman who he held captive over a weekend. Now, he had been at that home, living there and doing renovations, and then decided to terrorize this woman in 1989, who was just looking to help him out. But he was arrested for that assault. And again, when I look at these crimes, it's quite troubling how many chances that Jimmy Youngblood Smith got. I mean, this man had been committing robberies for years and basically helped in the murder of a police officer, but he got opportunity after opportunity. And while he was on parole again, after that situation, he then was arrested in Van Nuys for threatening a man with a knife. Now, after that situation, he then was continuing to not be in it. He was continuing to be in and out of jail. And as he was in and out of jail, what happened with Jimmy Youngblood Smith is that Jimmy Youngblood Smith, again, continued to have no regard for the law, no regard for the authority of the law. And as he had no regard for the law, eventually in 2007, almost 20, 30 years later, he violated his parole. And eventually what happened to Jimmy Youngblood Smith is that Jimmy Youngblood Smith, after violating parole, wound up inside of another detention center. And it was inside of that detention center where he eventually wound up dying of a heart attack. Now, this whole situation, again, shows what happens when you have beta males. What happens is many of these males do not know how to function because they don't have male life skills or male survival skills due to the dysfunctional way that they're raised. And because these men do not have functional male life skills or male survival skills, they don't know how to navigate life, and they make life miserable for everyone because as they become frustrated and angry about not being able to make life work, they turn to crime, and as they turn to crime, their crimes escalate to levels of extreme violence because these men went from robberies for their basic survival to looking to participate in this incident in the Onion Field to express their contempt for these officers, because in this entire incident they could have just easily just gone along with the officers and possibly just been arrested and then possibly processed and put out back again. But the reason why I believe they participated in that murder in the Onion Field and the kidnapping of these officers is because both of these men were frustrated about their lack of power and accomplishments in life, and they wanted to accomplish something in infamy because they couldn't accomplish anything that would make them famous. That is one of the things I believe motivated them to commit this crime, in addition to them looking to impulsively act as related to the kidnapping of the officers, because I believe that they kidnapped the officers because they saw it as an opportunity to go down in infamy, because these men had accomplished absolutely nothing over the course of their lives outside of being in and out of jail, and Jimmy Youngblood Smith going out here and having 2 illegitimate children. I mean, these men basically had nothing to show for their lives, and with beta males, a lot of times these men will do things to, like they will do to commit crimes to accomplish something in their life in infamy, because they don't know how to do anything as related to doing something that will allow them to show a constructive accomplishment for themselves. Because with many men want to accomplish things, but when you don't know how to do it, what happens is they just get frustrated and give up. And that's what I believe happened here as related to this tragic incident in the Onion Field. Now, this incident in the Onion Field not only took the life of Officer Ian Campbell, but it also scarred Officer Carl Hettinger for life, who felt survivor's guilt about the whole incident. And as he felt guilt about this incident for his entire life, I mean, he felt bad that he didn't go out here and be able to do what was right as related to this situation, because he was the one who basically wound up giving up his gun. And as he gave up his gun, he basically put his partner's life in danger. And as he put his life in danger, he resigned from the police department and basically wound up trying to stay on with his family and try to help his family, and eventually was appointed to a position in 1987 to the Kern Board of Supervisors, which he stayed in until 1993, where he died of liver failure. But he was living all his life with tremendous guilt about what happened, because he felt he could have done something about it, and he felt he could have done something about it, but the whole thing was that neither man really understood procedure. And eventually what happened to these men led to a complete change in police procedure in Los Angeles, which they created new training for officers called the Hettinger Memorandum. Now, this Hettinger Memorandum tells officers to never give up their weapons, and never give up their weapons, because if you give up your weapon, in a situation where somebody has a gun on an officer, you're basically in a situation where both of you are in jeopardy. But eventually all of this led to Hettinger himself, as he was dealing with his depression, becoming a man in crisis himself, because even though he was transferred to a job as the driver for the police chief, he began shoplifting, showing me how a man can wind up being put on the road to becoming a man in crisis. And sadly, this is the reason why Carl Hettinger wound up having to resign from the police department. And he was forced to resign from the police department because he had been participating in this antisocial behavior, and he wound up on this road to the antisocial behavior because of the feelings of powerlessness that he had. Again, feeling this powerlessness because of what happened to him and the trauma that happened to him. So he began participating in shoplifting in the 60s, but the LAPD still tried to help him after he wound up resigning from the LAPD, and that's why they wound up giving him that position as on the Kern County Board of Supervisors, because they saw how much trauma this man went through. I mean, This man lived up to about 59 years old, and what's sad is the two officers didn't live long, but these two criminals managed to live their lives fully all the way until 2007 and 2012. I mean, that's the great injustice. Those two criminals managed to live full lives, but the two officers wound up losing their lives when they were young, and their children wound up dealing with men who were dealing with a crisis themselves. I mean, these officers basically wound up becoming men in crisis when they ran into these men in crisis, and that's the great tragedy, is that all four of these men wound up tragically becoming men in crisis, and this whole situation was a troubling one to hear about this onion field, because this onion field shows how the whole situation with two men in crisis can wind up doing damage to the lives of people all around them. Now, this was a video requested by one of my viewers, and if you want to request a video, you can send a donation of a minimum of $15 to the Cash App or the PayPal by clicking the links in the description box. And if I know something about that historical man in crisis or group of people in crisis, I will make that video for you. Now, if you want to learn why males like this are motivated to participate in this kind of violence and the dysfunctional lifestyle that leads to them being on this road to crime, you can pick up my book, The Man Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Man Crisis at other online booksellers like Draft Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and you can find it at big box retailers like Walmart and Target. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback. From the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Man Crisis, comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback at Amazon.com and online booksellers today. Now available for the first time in paperback. Stop Simping in the Workplace. Men, learn what you need to know in order to protect your job from workplace predators with Stop Simping in the Workplace. Available in paperback at online booksellers everywhere. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.